It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on changing human behavior to improve green growth. My name is John Mon. I manage the research program at the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, GGKP. Before we begin today's webinar, I would like to provide you a few words of introduction. The GGKP is a global community of organizations and experts committed to collaboratively generating, managing, and sharing green growth knowledge and data. Let me underline that for a moment, because this is what GGKP is all about. Knowledge generation, knowledge management, knowledge sharing, collaboratively. We can't do this alone. GGKP is all about partnership. It was established only a few years ago by 4 partners: the World Bank, the OECD, the Global Green Growth Institute, and UN Environment. And today, GGKP is a partnership of over 50 organizations representing policymakers and policy researchers in countries all over the world. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from one of our founding partners, UN Environment, on a groundbreaking new report, Consuming Differently, Consuming Sustainably, Behavioral Insights for Policymaking. This report has been developed by UN Environment, which hosts the Secretariat of the 10-year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production, through a collaboration with Ideas 42. I want to thank Sarah Castro, who, though not a panelist today, not only led much of this work with the Sustainable Consumption and Production team at UN Environment, but also helped organize today's webinar. Sarah, together with Benjamin Banda of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, serve as co-chairs of a GGKP research committee devoted to behavioral insights. The committee is currently scoping out knowledge and data gaps and collecting case studies on behavioral insights to advance the knowledge frontier in human behavior and green growth. That makes today's topic, Behavioral Insights, Changing Human Behavior for Green Growth, especially timely. It joins a growing body of research and behavioral insights by UN Environment, the OECD, and many others that is challenging how we think about environmental policy making and how we've done so for decades. Now, before introducing our moderator for today's event, I'd like to highlight just a few important issues, logistical issues. First, we encourage participants to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff, who will then repost them to all participants for our panelists to address during the Q&A period. Also, we will be circulating a survey after the webinar concludes. It takes less than 5 minutes, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. If you want to share the webinar, or if you've missed anything, it is being recorded, and it will be available to you on the GGKP website within 24 hours. If during the webinar you have any technical issues, please email us at contact@ggkp.org. That is contact@ggkp.org. and we'll help you troubleshoot it through. And now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce to you today's moderator, Faisal Naru. Faisal is Senior Economic Advisor at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and a specialist in regulatory policy and governance. Faisal embarked on a career in regulatory reform, first as an international consultant and then in governments, both in Vietnam and the UK. Today at the OECD, he leads a variety of work on regulatory excellence, digital governance, and of course, behavioral economics. He also happens to join Sarah Castro as a member of the GGKP Behavioral Insights Research Committee. Faisal, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you very much to GGKP for inviting me for this very interesting and a very timely webinar on what is currently going on and what is some of the latest thinking in relation to how can we have sustainable consumption. I'm very delighted to be able to introduce firstly two presentations. First from Saugato Datta, who is the Managing Director at Ideas 42, and then secondly from Helio Mattar, who is the President and Chief Executive at Akatu Institute and 10YFP-CIP, which is a very long acronym, and I won't go into what it is, and I'll let Helio actually explain a bit more about that. And then after that, we're very privileged to have Claire Walsh, who works in JPAL at MIT. Who will be able to give some initial reflections and be a discussant for us on the two presentations that we hear. And then we'll open the floor out for questions from those of you who are tuned in at the moment. And we very much look forward to having an engaged discussion with many of you at this webinar today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Saugato Datta, so that we can get this webinar started.
Good morning, everyone, and I hope that you're seeing the slides on your screen. Just let me know if there's any problem. And welcome. Thank you, Faisal, for the introduction, and welcome to this webinar. I'm going to sort of dive right in and talk to you about a report that, as was mentioned, Ideas 42 worked on with UNEP about consuming differently, consuming sustainably, behavioral insights for policymaking. So just a quick, I'm just going to do a quick intro to how we're going to go through this presentation. So first, a little bit about Ideas 42. Next, a brief introduction to behavioral science. Third, the meat of this is going to be the central part of the report, which talks about 5 behavioral barriers to sustainable consumption. And finally, an example of how all of this comes together in a way that allows us to think about how to apply behavioral insights to sustainable consumption. So first, what is Ideas 42? You've just heard us mentioned. We are a nonprofit research and consulting firm that was founded at Harvard in 2008, and we use the insights of behavioral science to design solutions to some of the world's most persistent social problems. We do this by using insights from a number of different disciplines. Behavioral economics, of course, is central, cognitive psychology, social psychology, some insights from economics. And we do this by working with a variety of partners in many domains. And our partners tend to be from the nonprofit and from the government sector, although in some cases we also work with for-profit entities that work on pro-poor issues. And we do this in many countries around the world, so you're getting a sense of the various places that we have or have had projects. So I'm going to go into what I'm going to call the intro to behavioral science piece, and this is going to begin with a little game. It's a very, very simple game. I'm going to ask you to very quickly say which color you see on the screen. Now, this needs to be really fast, and you should not need much time to do this, so it's not about thinking too hard about this. We're going to go through this really fast. So for practice, this is blue, and we're going to be starting, so go fast and don't be inhibited, okay? All right, now, did you see what happened there? Of course, all of us are in different places, so I'm only guessing what happened, but I'm fairly sure that many people said blue instead of red, or actually needed a little bit of extra time to actually give what is really the right answer. And what we did here was actually a Stroop test, a classic test of executive control. What it tells us is that overriding what Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman called System 1 thinking, or automatic thinking, with System 2, or more deliberative thinking, is effortful. So that's what you had to do to say the color instead of the word you read on the screen. This may seem trivial, but it helps us understand fundamental aspects of human decision-making, such as why self-control is so difficult. And as you'll see, this is quite relevant to the kind of thing that we're talking about. Now, we're talking about this sort of decision-making because consumption is ultimately about individual behavior. Sustainability is embodied in millions of small decisions, such as choices about food, modes of transport, recycling, appliance purchases, and so on, made by millions around the world every day. But behavior is complicated. People don't always respond to what we think are obvious economic, moral, and health incentives and reasons. Understanding these unexpected, complicated aspects of human behavior is really what behavioral science is about. And to see what I mean, consider what I would call the traditional model of decision making. So this is what we've tried to represent on the screen here. What you see here is that this model, which is implicit in a lot of the time when we're thinking about human decision making, is a sort of seamless and linear transition from wanting an outcome to doing what is needed to be done in order to achieve it. So in this model, the crucial thing is that actions reveal intentions. So if I didn't do the thing that achieves X, I didn't really want to achieve X. That's how we would interpret what we see. In reality, though, this model was, I think, oversimplified and incomplete. It neglected a number of the environmental or contextual personal features that affect what we do. The behavioral model of decision-making puts these front and center. So this is sort of a cartoon representation of what one might call the behavioral model. And what it's doing is you're seeing now a number of things that traditional thinking about decision-making doesn't really think about, but that behavioral science does think about, and that these things are actually important. And the crucial thing here is that if I, in this case, don't do something, it's not necessarily because I didn't want to do it. It's possibly because features of my environment, both physical or social, or features of the task itself, could drive a wedge between what I want to do and what I actually do. Right? So here are some more. And to understand why this is relevant, let's think of a different domain than the one we're talking about today, thinking about public health. And what you see is that you get very different ideas about what to do about a problem, depending on whether you take the standard approach or a behavioral approach or a behavioral lens. So just to give you an example, a standard view of decision-making that might suggest that a solution to incomplete drug adherence, in other words, people not taking all their medications as they're supposed to, might involve educating people about why taking their medicines is important. A behavioral view might instead suggest that we create tools or aids, such as labeled pill boxes or timely reminders, to help people who have trouble translating an intention to adhere into actual adherence. Let me switch gears now and focus on some specific behavioral science insights relevant to sustainable consumption. These are, of course, at the heart of the report that we're discussing today. So in the report, we identify 5 behavioral barriers to sustainable consumption. These are not the barriers or the only barriers, but these are some central ones, we believe, based on the research and based on the evidence that we need to be thinking about. So the first of these is that many choices in consumption are habitual, by which we mean that people aren't necessarily making an active choice to do something, but are rather acting out of habit. So if we think about how people choose, for instance, their modes of transport, it might begin with an active choice. You might initially map out your route to work and decide what you're going to do and how you're going to get there. But once you've made that decision once, you become largely a creature of habit, and it's very hard to change this. So this is a little bit like brushing your teeth. You learn to do it at one point, then it becomes a habit. And what we can then do once we recognize that many of the behaviors we need to affect are no longer active decisions, but that they are actually habitual, we can use cues or prompts, such as ones that get people to set goals or prompting people to make informed travel plans ahead of time in order to reset this kind of habitual behavior. Here's the second of the principles. It is that the consequences of consumption are often hard to see. That's because they may be delayed or they may be quite small relative in the moment. So for instance, if I use more water or energy, I'm going to get a slightly higher bill, but I'm going to get it weeks later, so I don't immediately see the consequences of my own actions. Conversely, think of something like CFLs, which are cheaper and more energy efficient in the long run, but their upfront costs are higher than incandescents, which is what they're trying to replace. So this is particularly problematic because as behavioral scientists, we know that most people are what we call present biased. What this means is that they put far too high a weight on the immediate, and far too much of discounting takes place when you think about the future. So they're sort of weighing the present too highly and discounting things that happen far in the future, which is problematic for the reason that we just talked about. But again, once we know this, we can think about ways to address this. For instance, we could try to make long-term consequences more vivid and salient. Thirdly, sustainable consumption may not seem personally relevant. For example, it appears that while many people think that climate change is a serious problem, far fewer people are concerned with climate change harming them personally. Furthermore, our overconfidence in our judgment often makes us think that we do not need to change. This overconfidence often stems from motivated reasoning. We accept a problem's existence, we understand its broad implications, but then we think of reasons why it could not affect us personally. Next, our behavior is influenced by the behavior of others to a surprising degree. Often this is because we are uncertain, and so we look to the behavior of others to understand what is appropriate. And as consumers, our identities are very tied to the way we consume, how our homes look, how we commute, what we wear, and so on. And this is very visible as a part of our identities. One implication of this is that giving people feedback about how their behavior compares with those of their peers can help shift the behavior of those who are, in fact, outside what turns out to be the norm. Perhaps those who consume more electricity than their neighbors, a little later, will see how we can use this insight to affect water consumption. Finally, it can be surprisingly hard to act sustainably, even if intentions are strong or actions make economic sense. Sometimes, the way in which options are presented or arranged to the consumer, what behavioral scientists call the choice architecture, may actually steer people towards less sustainable choices. Once we understand this, though, we can try to make the sustainable option easier to choose and to act on. So for instance, a study conducted in Norwegian hotels decreased plate size and hung up signs encouraging guests to make multiple visits to the buffet table rather than filling up their plates all at once. And these interventions reduced food waste by around 20%. So how should we think about using these various insights? We know a lot of these insights from the research, but there's obviously a lot of work that has to be done when we think about actually applying it and actually designing interventions. But essentially, at Ideas 42, we certainly believe that this can and should be done systematically and scientifically. So we take an approach that you see on the screen here, where we're breaking a process of designing, testing, and scaling an intervention into these 5 steps. We'll see an example of this process later, but for now, let's just say that it's extremely important to define the behavior change that you want as precisely as possible, to ensure that you observe and understand the context well so that you can diagnose which bottlenecks are important and how to design for them, and that designs are rigorously tested, ideally against a randomly chosen control group. In many cases, what we find is that we can run rapid A/B type tests that use administrative data together with randomization to measure outcomes, and so these tests can be quick, cheap, and easy, not like a big multi-year RCT that looks at long-term impact, but rather changing various elements of the environment, changing various elements of how people engage with what's around them, and looking for administrative data to understand what the effects of these interventions are. So finally, in the couple of minutes that are left to me, I'm going to take you through an example of how we at Ideas 42 have applied this process that I talked about and some of these insights that we've talked about very briefly to an actual problem on sustainable consumption. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a project we did on residential water use in a town called Belén in Costa Rica. So for background, Belén is a small town in the middle of Costa Rica. On average, a household in Belén consumes about 1.25 times, so 1.25 times the national average in terms of water use. And as we know, water use has been increasing throughout the 20th century and continues to rise. So this is a serious concern, particularly for urban areas where they're concerned about not being able to provide enough water for people as populations grow, urbanization proceeds, and there are limits on what can be done in terms of accessing clean water for drinking and for other needs. So the Ideas 42 project that I'm talking about was in collaboration with the World Bank and was dealing with this issue in the context of the municipality of Belén in Costa Rica. So in order to try and understand what we could do to reduce water consumption among households in Belén, we needed to understand why they were behaving the way that they did and what the behavioral factors were that were influencing water use. We did this by conducting focus groups with residents and by analyzing water consumption data. And we found several interesting things that were useful in thinking about what we could do to intervene. So first, we find that while people appreciated the need for conservation in the aggregate, they did not believe that they personally needed to reduce consumption. And this will sound familiar because it's quite similar to one of the insights in the report that I talked about before. Secondly, we saw that people rarely knew how much water they were consuming. Thirdly, they lacked a benchmark to compare their water consumption against. And finally, very few, if any, could list concrete steps that they could take to conserve water. Armed with this information, we designed and tested a several-part intervention. So we randomized the households in Belén into 4 groups, 1 control group and 3 treatment groups, and each of the treatment groups was given a different intervention that tried to address some of the bottlenecks we identified earlier. So first, in the neighborhood comparison, we provided direct feedback to households about how their consumption compared to that of the average household in their neighborhood using stickers pasted onto their water bills. In the municipal comparison, we did exactly the same thing, but this time we compared them to average consumption in town. And in the planning postcard intervention, we gave residents a postcard with their bill that enabled them to compare their own consumption with that of their peers, set water consumption goals, and identify concrete steps they could take to achieve them. We tested this, as I said, in a randomized trial with about 1,300 households in each of the arms. And we did this, of course, in order to ensure that we were able to attribute any changes that we saw to the effects of our interventions rather than anything else that might have happened. And the interesting thing is that the first and the third intervention, the neighborhood comparison, the planning prompts, led to around the same, about 5.6% or 5.5% reductions in monthly water consumption for several months following the intervention. And if you want a sense of what this means in the context of a town like Belén, so in a town of about 5,000 households, this is a lot of water saved if you think about the number of dishwasher loads or washing machine loads of water that was used. So that was it, one example of the way in which behavioral insights can be applied to sustainability. The report, of course, has many more examples of this exciting and important area of work. So with that, I can turn it back over to Faisal to continue with the rest of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Saugato, thank you very much for that presentation. I must admit, firstly, I was one of those people who immediately shouted out blue as soon as the word blue came up in red. So I'm as guilty as anybody else of those biases. And I think you touched upon many very, very important points, and I'm sure we'll be speaking a lot more about those in the question and answer session afterwards. But I think in particular the example you have from Costa Rica and Belén is also an example that we have in our report that just came out last week in the OECD, where it's very interesting how you start to not only have nudges or behavioral insights, but also start to have a look at what kind of active choices can be done in order to try and change consumption behaviors. And we're now going to hear more about this, and it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce now Helio Mattar, President of the Akatu Institute for Conscious Consumption. And we're very much looking forward to now hearing from you, Helio, about the work that you've been doing and why change is central to achieving sustainable consumption and productivity. Over to you, Helio.
Thank you very much, Faisal. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar together with you and Saugato and Claire. I'll be talking about the work of Akatu Institute on behavioral change of consumers, especially related to sustainable consumption, but also to production. Our institute has the mission to mobilize people to use the transforming power of their conscious consumption acts as an instrument to build the sustainability of life in the planet. And we define conscious consumption as being consumption with a better impact. Impact on the environment, impact on society, on the economic side, and on the individual. The way we work, we develop contents, pedagogy, consumer research, metrics, games, which is in the center of this slide, group dynamics and methodologies, and we take it to communication and to education. On the communication side, we use companies to disseminate conscious consumption concepts and practices within the companies using our methodology. In advertising, we have magazines and newspapers and agencies involved in disseminating conscious consumption. We are the main reference in media, and when we have the social mobilization done through social networks. On the side of education, we work with communities and educational institutions, and I have the opportunity of showing some of this. In this difficult slide to look at is our strategy in one page. Basically look at the center, mobilization, trying to engage and involve society with conscious consumption practices, and articulations, which means articulate social actors for consumer practices consistent with a sustainable society, are at the center of our strategy, based on the contents and the methodology that we use. It's important to see what is the importance of the consumption in the world of sustainability. Today, we already consume 60% more natural resource than the Earth can regenerate. And more important, less than 20% of humanity, which means 1.3 billion people, consume almost 80% of total consumption. So consumption is extremely concentrated around the globe. Within that scenario, we have the emerging middle class in several countries coming in the market into the mass consumption market. And a lower estimate of 75 million people are entering each year in that market, which means to say 1.5 billion people will enter the mass market in only 20 years. If the same model of production and consumption were to be maintained, and if 2.8 billion people were to consume the 1.3 billion we started with, plus the 1.5 of the emerging markets, people who are entering the market, and would consume as the present average consumer of the 20% of humanity, one would need the natural resources of more than 4 planets to supply that volume of consumption. Of course, we don't have that, and some people for many years thought that probably technology change by itself would be able to provide such gains in productivity in only 20 years. Well, our answer is it's not possible. It would be necessary to have a 75% reduction in the use of natural resources per average unit of product or service in 20 years. Why 75%? Because we would use 4 planets and we have only 1. So that's 3/4 reduction in order to get to only 1 planet, in order to be able to serve 2.8 billion consumers with only 1 planet. If we take the productivity growth from 92 to 2012, which means 20 years, per dollar of production, there was a reduction of 23% in materials and 21% in emissions, which means an enormous increase in productivity. However, since the volume of consumption grew during that period at high rates, there was an increase in total materials consumed of 41% and an increase in total emissions of 39%, showing how difficult it is to really reduce from 4 planets to 1 planet to increase productivity by 75%. For that reason, we look at the sustainability equation as necessarily involving 5 items. One is the radical change in technology. The second one we'll be talking about is behavioral changes leading to different consumption behavior. The third is radical changes in public policy. Fourth, radical changes in products and services. And finally, a new organization of society. Talking about the behavioral changes, one of the things that Akatu found out in its work is that we should not be talking to consumers in a negative way, like proposing less consumption. Consumers will react negatively. Consumption must be different, not less. Different, and to be shown to lead to the same or better level of well-being of consumers, and that's what we try to do. The framework of action of Akatu uses a pedagogical methodology in which rational and emotional understanding of the impacts of consumption is used to create motivation for behavior change, complemented with a repertoire of new behaviors. And as you can see, this respond to some of the Saugato barriers directly. This will catalyze change in behavior if we have then understanding of the impacts, motivation to act in changing behavior, and a repertoire to access in terms of consumption behaviors that would enable more sustainable consumption. In order to do that, the behavioral change methodology used by Akatu has 6 steps. To change consumption behavior, it is necessary for consumers to realize first that their acts of consumption will hugely impact his or her own life, the environment, the society, the economy, and the individual. So this is the relevance of the impacts. The second is that his or her acts of consumption will have impacts on everybody and will affect also himself or herself in return. This is the interdependence. The third, and one of the most important ones, is the power of daily behavior. And even his or her small acts of consumption or of a small group of consumers repeated over a long period of time will have very, very big impacts. Like, for instance, if you close the tap to brush your teeth during 70 years of your life, you're going to save 3/4 of an Olympic swimming pool full of water. We use the image to provoke the emotional reaction of people, and that's very important in our methodology. Fourth, the leading by example, his or her example by itself influences other consumers' behavior. So one consumer is never alone doing something. There's always family and friends together with them. And also that the consumer have to realize that given the tools, he or she can be a mobilizer of other people towards conscious consumption. And when many people adopt it, it will rapidly produce very large impacts. Finally, given these 5 steps, the change in behavior in one person or a small group is performed, but it's necessary to build reference groups so that he or she can be part of a movement for conscious consumption by mobilizing reference groups that will result in a positive feedback for the movement, a sense of belonging to the movement of conscious consumption. Examples of the 6 steps: the first, in relevance of impacts in food waste. The amount of food waste in Brazil would be sufficient to continually feed almost 20 million people. So the impact in total food waste is enormous. The second, in interdependence, we use meat consumption in this example. Cattle raising is extensive land use which causes deforestation in the Amazon region. So meat consumption by consumers contributes for the increase in deforestation, and that is used as part of the process. The power of daily behavior in an example with residues, we call the garbage apartment. If an average Brazilian family would keep all the garbage produced throughout the life of its members, 73 years, they would need a deposit equivalent to the size of 3 60 square meters apartments loaded with garbage from floor to ceiling. That's a lot of garbage. The leading by example, looking at the change in behavior of one individual, it will inspire changing behavior of his or her peer group and family, as the picture here can show you quite well. In the mobilization process, as usually in the brushing of teeth, again, if 1 million people would close the tap when brushing their teeth for 1 month, the amount of water saved would be equivalent to the water falling from the Iguazu Falls, which is in this picture, for 12 minutes. Only 1 million people, only for a month. Finally, in terms of building reference groups, we use the example of the Bike Angels. There is a growing adherence to the use of bicycles in large cities in Brazil by becoming members of a group called Bike Angels, which is seen as being cool and a modern way to be, helping build a new social norm for urban mobility within that group and to disseminate it to other groups. The methodology in practice, we use it in research, education, collaboration with companies, and communication and mobilization of society. In research and contents, we publish research on consumer behavior, and we develop conscious consumption indicators. In the conscious consumption indicators, there is a platform for test application, which will reveal the level of consciousness in consumption based on the behaviors of the consumer into 4 different groups. Into 4 different groups: indifferent, beginner, engaged, and conscious. And that can be shown to a person, to a group, or to a set of groups comparing the results. In education of children and youth, we have a platform called Akatu, which is the first Brazilian learning network on concepts and practices of sustainability and conscious consumption, which is directed towards teachers and students of elementary and middle schools all across Brazil. We have thematic circuits of knowledge and experience, starting challenges or proposing challenges and activities to realize the presential and virtual mode of the platform in circuits like nature, health, eating, water, waste, hygiene, and health and energy. In 2016, after 2.5 years, we have 3,000 schools, 4,000 teachers, and 30,000 students using this platform. In the collaboration of companies, I'll just show a few examples. With Walmart, we use 1,000 multipliers in 17 states of Brazil and 380 stores to mobilize 90,000 employees towards conscious consumption and sustainability. The result was very interesting. We used the personal project on sustainability developed by Walmart, in which each employee chose one area and proposed goals to be set for a period of time. In Brazil, 88% of the employees had a personal program in sustainability. In the United States, within the same period of time, 22% only had a personal program in sustainability. We did that in Bradesco, a large bank with 10,000 employees, in an insurance company with 300 employees, in Electro, which is a distribution of electricity company with 400 community leaders and teachers in 15 schools, in CNA with 300 volunteers to act as multipliers, and in communities like the university. We applied it to the Unicamp University in interior part of São Paulo, where we create awareness in leaders and develop them to be multipliers. These leaders were students at university, and they mobilized freshmen to work in activities in daycare centers and to work in activities with residues in the area around the university. The result of that was that the amount of residues in 10 days of work of these students with the neighborhood, the amount of residues increased by 57%. In communication mobilization, we have advertising campaigns with key issues of sustainability in magazines, newspapers. These are some images. This is a campaign of 1/3 of everything you buy goes straight to the garbage. Is a campaign in which we use the same type of advertising supermarkets use to call the attention to the waste in food. We have a series of videos and animations on conscious consumption. We have apps for mobile and internet. And in the media, we are the major reference in debates and discussion. In the last 5 years, we had space occupied freely by Akatu of about $60 million in newspapers, magazines, radio, and TV. We need radically new products. These will require changing behaviors of consumption. So we work in workshops trying to show that the change will have to be in the direction of durable goods, local production, shared use goods, full use of all the goods to the end of their lives, healthy products, virtual products, sufficiency and not excess, and experience in place of tangible. These workshops of 8 hours are designed for dialogue and activities to foster understanding, motivation, and repertoire. Changes in public policy, we work with public policy in education for sustainability, educational campaigns, voluntary regulation and advertising, and taxation incentives in terms of incentives and disincentives, leading actors in society demanding change in public policy. A final word is that we should always remember that there is no silver bullet that leads to consumption behavior change. The process depends on mass and frequency of education and communication effort in the right direction, to the right people, at the right time, using the right message, so that we'll get to a different consumption from a paradigm of products going to a paradigm of well-being and not more any longer a paradigm of products. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have taken a little bit long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Helio, and thank you very much for the very. Also, I'd like to say to the audience that is listening in, please do keep your questions coming in. We already have quite a large number coming in, and some very interesting questions, because the two presenters have certainly raised lots of important issues, which is sparking much interest. But before we turn to the questions coming from the audience, it's with great pleasure to introduce Claire Walsh. Claire Walsh, who sits on the GGKP's Behavioural Research Committee, but is also the Environment and Energy Sector Manager at JPEL in MIT. Claire, it's great to see you, and over to you in relation to what your thoughts are based upon what you've heard so far.
Great, thanks so much, Faisal. It's an honor to be here. First, I want to say a big congratulations to Ideas 42, to UN Environment, to the GGKP for this powerful and cogent report that really makes a strong case for the benefits of applying behavioral insights and behavioral science to increase sustainable consumption. So I'm going to focus my comments on 3 different things. First, some of the key insights I took away from the report and Helio and Saugato's amazing presentations today. Then I want to talk about some additional information I think I would need if I were a policymaker before investing in behavioral insights for sustainable consumption. And then third, some key open questions where I think more investigation is needed. So first, the insights I took away from the report and the presentations. There are many things that struck me, and I will quickly discuss 5. So first is just that there is a strong accumulation of evidence that behavioral insights can and have changed consumption behavior. This is across sectors, not just in environment and sustainability, but in health and finance, etc. And even within sustainability, there's a lot of evidence that this works for lots of different types of resources and behaviors, whether they're related to energy, water, waste, transportation decisions, etc. I think one of the key pieces of evidence for that is that this is not even a full literature review of all the completed studies on this topic in this fabulous report, but I counted at least 20 randomized evaluations in this paper that show that behavioral insights can change consumption behavior and make it more sustainable. And I think that's a strong case for investing in this approach. The fact that a lot of these interventions worked also highlighted to me that there's a large amount of inefficiency and low-hanging fruit that behavioral insights could help address. There's a really smart recommendation at the end of the report to start by applying behavioral science to improve existing policies, regulations, and products. And I think that's a really wise recommendation because I think there's a lot of slack in the system that could be addressed through behavioral insights. I think walking away from seeing these presentations and reading this report is that governments, firms should not think that providing people with information or access to programs is enough to fundamentally change consumption behavior. Choices for energy and water consumption and other types of consumption habits are habits that are about convenience and rather than conscious or active choice. And I don't think any policymaker should think that investing in financial incentives for getting people to engage in more sustainable behaviors or providing information on why they're beneficial personally or for society alone are enough to change consumption, and that these more behavioral types of nudges can make up a lot of the slack that those other interventions can't. The third thing that struck me is that in terms of effect size, I think if you look across studies, individual nudges beyond things like switching the default tend to have small effects on individuals or households that add up to a meaningful impact when they're accumulated over a large group of individuals or households. And so that tells me a few things, I think, if I were to put on my policymaker hat. One, it tells me that behavior change and behavioral insights are only one small piece of the equation. I really, really appreciate Helio's amazing slide that says the sustainability equation necessarily involves not just behavior change, but also radical changes in technology, radical changes in public policy, a new set of products and services. And I think that's really true, and behavioral insights are part of it, but they need to be part of a much larger agenda. The second thing the smaller effect sizes suggest to me is that in targeting who I work with as a policymaker wanting to invest in behavioral insights, I should maybe prioritize the types of firms or institutions that already reach a really large number of people, like utility companies, water companies, recycling companies, etc. And I read some kind of interesting statistics in this report that say that households only make up 29% of global CO2 emissions, and I'm guessing that they make up even a smaller proportion of overall global water use. And so I think it's an interesting question whether there might be an opportunity to apply some of these insights for individuals to larger institutions like firms to change their consumption behavior, or as in the great examples that Helio provided, getting them to apply behavioral insights and getting their employees to change their consumption behavior. The last thing I want to applaud about the report is the really smart approach it took to the question of whether the findings from one randomized evaluation or one test of a behavioral insight could be applied to a new context. And that's because you gave it a really more sophisticated treatment than many people I speak to usually apply to this question. Usually people make simple comparisons like, oh, Mexico is a different country than El Salvador. It worked in El Salvador, but it probably won't work in Mexico. Mexico is different. I think the Belen example was really a much better way to go about this generalizability question, because you did a lot of formative and qualitative research at the beginning of the study to diagnose whether the underlying problem related to water use in Belen was the same as the problem related to energy use in the United States with the first studies from O-Power's home energy reports. And I think you found that they faced really similar barriers. They didn't believe that they were contributing to the problem. They didn't have a benchmark of whether they were using too much or too little. Residents couldn't identify concrete steps to reduce water use. And I think that's a really smart way to identify interventions that may work across contexts. Okay, so next I want to get on to, I think that additional information I would need if I were a policymaker to invest in this type of approach, behavioral insights and behavioral science approach to sustainable consumption. The main recommendations of the report as I read them are that policymakers should invest in a behavioral science approach to designing interventions to encourage sustainable consumption, builds their capacity internally to do this type of behavioral science and support this type of behavioral science in general. I think these are all good recommendations, but in some ways it felt a little bit like a bait and switch because the recommendation was to adopt behavioral science, not adopt behavioral insights that have been shown to encourage conservation. So I guess my question would be, are there any behavioral insights that have strong enough evidence in multiple contexts that they can be effective, that policymakers should consider adopting them after diagnosing that they face the same barriers to action and maybe piloting the intervention to make sure it's implementable and makes sense? I guess my question is, do we always need to do another RCT? When do we not? And maybe I would love to hear a little bit more about the case for why continual testing is important. So second, I think it's an open question whether nudges are more effective in inducing conservation than things like financial incentives or changes in prices. I really think the jury's still out on this one. There are only 2 studies I know of that directly compare in a randomized evaluation a change in a financial incentive to a more behavioral type nudge. One from Japan where it showed the price intervention was better at inducing energy conservation than the nudge, and one in India where it showed the opposite, that the nudge in fact was effective in reducing energy conservation on its own, but when you added positive financial incentives, the impact of the nudge disappeared. So I think this is an important area for future research. So I already mentioned it, but another question I would have as a policymaker is, where do behavioral insights fit into a larger policy agenda and related to sustainable consumption, and what proportion of our resources should we devote to this approach? These may be less costly policy options, quicker, less politically unpopular, but they might also have a smaller total impact than larger structural changes in the way we produce energy, for instance. But those policies, on the other hand, tend to be way more costly, politically unpopular, but might have a larger total impact. So I think talking about those trade-offs would be really useful. I think there's a good case to be made for the cost effectiveness of behavioral insights, but it would be really nice to see some cost data in future analyses. I can see why changing the defaults on printing is, basically $0. It's just getting your IT guy to change the settings. But something like a Power Home Energy report, I imagine it does cost some money to provide these monthly reports, and it would be nice to see actual program costs in order to make judgments about cost effectiveness. Last, before I get into the areas of places where I think we need more research, is that I wonder what the role of firm is in applying behavioral insights. It seems like a lot of behavioral insights don't have to be implemented by a government. And for instance, there's the great success of the private sector firm Power, now owned by Oracle. They created a product that utilities wanted that also had these great benefits of reducing energy consumption. So do I, as a government, have to invest in behavioral science, or should I encourage the private sector to innovate in this space and perhaps provide apps that induce wide-scale behavior change among employees of major companies related to conservation? Okay, the last thing, I'm probably taking up too much time, but I'll just discuss quickly, I think, some important gaps in our knowledge and areas for future research. One is that obviously it's clear, and it states it in the report, that we have far fewer completed studies from developing countries than we do from developed countries. And so I think this is an important area for future research. I think issues of equity do come into play. I wouldn't necessarily think about trying to get people who already have very poor access to energy to consume less, but I would be encouraged by research that looks into whether behavioral insights can be applied to get low-income consumers who are perhaps using energy for the first time to invest in cleaner technologies, renewables. JPAL-affiliated professors are working on studies going on right now in East Africa related to increasing the adoption of solar power in Kenya, microgrid power in Bihar in India, and in ways to improve the sustainability and financial sustainability of electricity provision in India and South Africa. I think Another important area for future research is whether nudges should be targeted or applied to everyone. Usually we think they, or the way we've implemented them in the past is that they're applied to everyone. Can we understand whether some people are more responsive to nudges than others? And can we increase the magnitude of the impact of nudges by targeting to the people who are most responsive? Like I said earlier, I think some randomized evaluations that compare financial incentives and nudges directly can help us understand whether they're substitutes, whether they're complements, whether this depends on the choice that's being made, whether, you know, it's not always clear whether they're one or the other, etc. Another area that I think should not fall by the wayside is something that Helio talked about a lot, which is the role of social movements and advocacy. I think this approach may not be amenable to behavioral science, but I don't think we should only invest in policies we know how to experiment with. And the historical record is that social movements have been critical in changing social norms related to consumption. This is true in the historical record on littering, on smoking, on foot binding. So can broader social movements and advocacy efforts help change not only day-to-day behaviors, but create a permanent change in norms. And perhaps that's an area for further exploration by anthropologists, sociologists, etc. Last I'll close, because I'm probably taking up too much time, is this really sticky question that I don't think I know the answer to yet, but I think it's an exciting area for future research, is whether we can also apply behavioral insights and nudges to firms. There's an argument in economics that firms are closer to the rational actor and rational decision-making models because it's a lot of actors together deliberating, and when they deliberate, they end up making the rational choice rather than the choice that might be affected by behavioral biases. But actually, I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and probably quantitative survey evidence as well that firms are organizations with their own culture and behavioral quirks, and they're made up of individuals. So can behavioral insights be applied to them? I think there's a strong case that social norms and reputation can be a powerful lever in the corporate world as well. And that's why we see a lot of organizations like Ceres and others building coalitions of corporations that are dedicated to sustainable consumption and production. So I think that's an area for future study. So I'll stop there. I probably went way over, but thank you so much. I think this is a fabulous report, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Claire, for that. Very, very insightful. And I was busy trying to scribble as much of it down as possible because there are so many good points within there. And I think you've touched upon lots of different parts. So maybe we can start to begin to unpack some of those, especially in relation to some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. And please do continue to send your questions in. But maybe if we can start with the last point that you made, Claire, which was about firms and about how firms can be used to change some of the behavior, but also in relation to some other questions that have been put forward from Garrett Clark and Serban Scriciu, who are asking also a bit more about not just firms affecting individuals' behavior, but what about actually affecting the behavior of businesses and governments themselves? And what about trying to begin to think about how behavioral insights can start to influence institutional behavior or organizational behavior, so that you have a greater sum, I guess, in terms of the benefits, rather than simply just concentrating on individuals at each and every time. So maybe I can throw that first question open to the panel. I mean, Saugato, maybe if you want to start, seeing as you've been waiting longest afterwards, and then Helio, if you want to add in the Claire as well.
Sure, absolutely. I hope you guys can hear me. So I wanted to second Claire's point, which is that I think actually this ties, I think, several of the points she raised together about, where are the effect sizes, if the effect sizes are relatively small on individuals, should we be looking for avenues that are actually a large collection of individuals? And I think firms or sort of work settings in many ways are that sort of environment. And there's beginning to be, I think, a little bit of work that is maybe not looking yet at sort of firms changing consumers' behavior in this way, but certainly changing the behavior of people within an organization. There was work certainly that I think the OECD did about electricity, was it air conditioning or heating settings, if I remember correctly, in the OECD itself, a wonderful example of policymakers experimenting on themselves. We have, for example, been working with the Western Cape government, and one of the things there was to try and use very similar ideas about peer feedback and about people monitoring each other, social comparison to affect the behavior of a large number of people in a shared setting. So, and that's, I think, particularly interesting also to think of one of Claire's other points, which was, what about financial incentives versus these kinds of nudges, which I think is a really important question, but is often also sort of framed by the fact that not all of these things are possible in every setting. So if you think about an office setting, there's no, there's really no correspondence that I can see as a user between my behavior and any kind of financial burden, because that's not being borne by the user. So that's where perhaps there's more of a case for saying, what are the other things we can do, because we're not going to be able to use prices here. But I think therefore there is a lot, I think, that we could be doing, taking this lens of organizations, firms are composed of people and therefore have their individual biases, but given the nature of social decision making, some of this may actually be magnified in this setting. And so what can we do with exactly the kinds of ideas we're tossing around here? I think it'll be really interesting to see more work. So.
Thank you, Saugato. Helio.
Yes, I'll follow on what Saugato and Claire discussed in terms of the large collection of individuals. Consumption is not an individual decision, actually. Consumption is a social practice. And being a social practice, it depends on social norms, it depends on values in the society, it depends on the products that are offered, the services that are offered, it depends on the public policies in general. That's why the sustainability equation that I propose, I think is very important. So how to put large collections of individuals together so that they will have insights about the change in consumption also together, so that this will become easily, in an easier way, it will become part of the group insight and not only the individual insight, I think is very important. So for instance, if we take schools, it's part of the work that Akatu is doing in relatively large scale. And in general, people will say, well, education takes too long. And my answer to that is, yes, it takes long. But if in 1992, in the Rio conference, there was a decision to implement education for sustainability, today we would have a whole generation of people educated under different values and different, relatively different norms. So schools are important. Firms together working with their employees, because that's groups, and groups is the way to go in terms of changing the insights and thereafter changing behavior. And also take the role of firms, specifically to your question, Faisal, as Claire was saying, in terms of reputation. Companies are more and more worried about the impact on society and on society and on the environment, and have been demanded by consumers to do differently, to use their power to change society and change environment positively. And that forms the reputation of companies, over which companies don't have any control. Actually, companies should look into that, look into the products they propose to the market in order to be more sustainable, and not marginally more sustainable, but radically more sustainable, like durable products. And in those cases, you have to have an enormous change in behavior of consumers, because consumers have to realize that they will pay more, but they will have the product for longer periods of time. So not to feel like paying a higher price is something that doesn't come with a benefit with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Helio. And I think that, I mean, that speaks very powerfully, I think, Claire, to your second to last point, actually, which was about the importance of the role of social movements and about having almost redefining social norms in themselves. And we had a question from Dr. Robert Lepeniz, who was asking you in particular, in relation to that normative change. Do you see tensions between experimental methodology and more participatory approaches? And how much methodological reflection can take place among proponents of behavioral policy?
That's an excellent question, and I think there are a lot of different disciplines in consumption behavior change, and I think it's important for us to talk more and try to draw insights across disciplines. It's not always easy, but I think part of the problem is that we don't interact enough. I think in terms of the use of randomized evaluations, you know, they're really useful for answering causal questions and providing an unbiased measure of the impact of a particular intervention on an outcome of interest. But I don't think anyone at JPAL would say that we think they're the only useful research method, and that other research methods are just as critical, and different research methods are better at answering different things. I think one challenge we've always seen with randomized evaluations is that it's hard to think about applying them to things that can't be randomly allocated. So things like advocacy, advertising that's trying to create a social movement. You know, you could think about you know, randomly assigning it to some individuals but not others, but that's not how you run an advocacy campaign. You want it to reach everyone and change the social norm. And so I think there, you know, randomized evaluations might not be the best way to answer that question, and I'd be excited to see work from sociologists and anthropologists, and, you know, I know there's a lot of really good work out there by Jennifer Jacquet at NYU and others about how social movements can change norms and behavior, particularly among institutions. So I think, you know, in terms of research methods, I think they just answer different questions, and all are critical in terms of improving policy.
And Saugato, I mean, talking a bit more about the social change, I mean, how do we know that we've actually had social change? We have some questions here from, firstly, Sarah Castro, who I'm sure everyone knows, but also Catherine Knoll and Marla Bergener, who are asking a bit more about what kind of metrics can we use to actually assess whether or not change has actually happened, and in particular around rebound effects, and how can we begin to measure some of those as well?
Thanks. Those are great questions, and I think that also speaks to some of the points that Claire made in terms of, you know, should we be targeting these kinds of interventions more at particular subsets of the population? I think without an enormous amount of rigorous evidence to back that claim up, I'm going to say yes, because I think when you look at any of these studies, you're really finding that the overall treatment effects are coming out of what one might call sort of the nudgeable population. You know, there's people whose behavior is amenable to change and who are kind of ready for it. And the question then becomes, in some sense, A, can you identify these people beforehand, and B, how did they get there? And that's where I think the role of social movements and of awareness and of a lot of the other things that have been talked about are critical, because you don't get that body of people who, you know, we're sort of thinking of them as people who are able to change or willing to change, but then they need a little bit of kind of help doing that. But it takes work, a lot of very important work to get to that point. And so I think that these are all sorts of things that we should be addressing. I think there is also, I would say, and again, to the questions you just raised, and I think Claire made the point about things like cost effectiveness. I think there is a real need for more collation and standardization of how we think about some of these things. When we think about scaling interventions, you know, really tracking how far interventions have got, and also tracking, I think, you know, we tend to sort of leave it at we've done the randomized evaluation and now we have the results from this, but how do these interventions then spread? And I think there's sort of this fascinating tension in some ways between wanting to maintain the purity of your design, which is important for as we're talking about, causal effects, at the same time, how does this stuff spread? It's sort of by diluting that design, right? You kind of want the people to go and tell their friends that something is interesting or something is useful, and those friends might be in your control group. But I think if we had better ways of kind of tracking some of these things, and we talked more to policymakers about what needed to be in place for that to happen, I think that would help. We're beginning, I think the report that Faisal, your group, has put out at OECD is a fantastic first step towards just kind of identifying the corpus of things that have been done, what do we know about them, and so on. We're working, for example, at something that is tentatively called BE Hub, which is going to be a sort of a web home for a lot of information about these kinds of interventions, but specifically trying to not just say this is what was done, this is what we found, but also to try and get together what were the actual materials that were used, what were the numbers that were reached, and critically trying to develop metrics around cost effectiveness that we can maybe go back to people and get hold of and try to put together in some coherent way. And I think if we do that, and there are a number of such initiatives I think that are happening, and I think together they will help to begin to answer some of those questions, but some of them definitely are in that category of we need more research and we don't quite know yet. Everything from how long do these effects last, what would be needed to be done at subsequent stages, what's the optimal frequency of doing some of this stuff, who should we be targeting? These are all completely open questions that I think we don't have answers to yet.
And just very quickly, in response to the question about measuring rebound effects, I can point you to a couple really interesting studies that have done that quite creatively. One is called Cash for Coolers by Paul Gertler, Lucas Davis, and Alan Fuchs, which looks at a large-scale national appliance replacement program in Mexico that incentivized people, provided them with subsidies to replace their inefficient refrigerators or inefficient air conditioners with more energy efficient models, and they actually really precisely measured the rebound effect related to air conditioners. Another is Michael Greenstone, Catherine Wolfram, and Meredith Fowley's paper about the impact of the weatherization assistance program in Michigan, where they actually put little temperature monitors in people's homes to understand whether, when people had more energy efficient homes, whether that just made them more likely to use electricity. And they actually find that it doesn't. People weren't more likely to heat their homes excessively in winter. So I think, the jury's still out on, the size of the rebound effect and whether it occurs and how large it is, if it really cancels out the effects of energy efficiency investments. And I think it really does depend on the particular context. But those are two studies that measure it quite precisely.
Thank you, Claire. And I think in relation to the point that both of you have mentioned on the cost effectiveness, in the report that you were mentioning that we just came out with, Saugato, we tried to look into that, and we tried to find out some kind of information on the cost effectiveness of running randomized control tests and having the kind of behavioral interventions and what would be the outcomes. And you're right, at this stage, I think that there is very little information about that. So I think that's still an area for further work. Who knows? We may undertake to do it again at some point to try and find out. But I think that is going to be quite critical. I think moving forward, for how behavioural insights can begin to become more utilised amongst public institutions, and particular, I think, in relation to this particular topic that we're talking about today, on sustainable consumption and on consumption patterns and consumption behaviours, because that's going to be critical for many people to understand the full argument, I guess, of what is the real benefit of actually conducting this at all. I wanted to also just quickly mention that unfortunately, I think our connection to Brazil has failed us slightly, and Helio has slightly dropped off for now, but we hope to get him reconnected very shortly. But I did want to turn to another question which was being made, and this is still on the themes of slightly on social norms, but also on the applicability of behavioural insights. And both Latif Saida and also Kasia Nekarashwitz were both asking a bit more about the cultural transferability, if you like, of behavioural insights across different contexts, across different countries. In particular, Cassia was asking more about developing how you can maybe transfer some of the interventions from more developed economies to developing economies, for instance, in relation to the use of plastic bags and things like that. I mean, again, the report that we just came out, we had a number of different interventions from both developing and developed economies, from many places like Ghana and Kenya to much more developed places as well. But I wanted to hear from both of you, Saugato and Claire. I mean, what do you think about this, and any tips you have, considering the fact that both of you are very operational in different contexts, for those people out there who would also like to begin to think about how to apply behavioural insights, but aren't quite sure about whether or not this can actually be applied in different cultural contexts.
So maybe if you like, I can go first for and Claire can add. I think Claire actually did already sort of brought this up, right, in terms of the sort of replicability, transferability, just across different contexts. And of course, those differences become larger in some ways when you're talking about taking something from a developed country context to a developing country context. And they become larger and important in sort of two ways. One is, of course, are those kind of fundamental behavioral barriers that we're talking about, do they operate in similar ways, or are there subtle differences in how they operate? And secondly, the constraints that you're facing may be quite different. The costs that you're facing will be quite different. The regulatory environment you're facing may be quite different. And so those two things definitely interact. And what that means, I think, in my experience, is that it's very rarely that you can completely port something over from one setting to the other. But it's also very rarely that the core insight doesn't have any applicability at all. So I think that there's a balance to be struck there. So I think the tip, if I have one, would be, sort of not to be too literal, but to try to think about what is the underlying insight here, and then to do that work which is required to see whether some of that operates in the setting where you are. I mean, to take a very sort of slightly ridiculous example, we have a number of interventions that look at things like drug adherence in US context, and they do things like remind people or create, and I gave some examples of this, right, like create aids for people to be able to take their medicines regularly. Now, if you want to transport that to a developing country, I think you have to ask a bunch of fundamental questions first about, do people have access? Are these things affordable? Do they actually have the medicines? Are there things in place for them to be able to get to that point where we would be concerned about issues of forgetting, which is really what this is tackling. I think what we would find, though, is that conditional on all those things being met, or maybe for the subset of the population, for those that are met, you do see very similar issues around memory and prospective memory failure are going to pop up, but you will have to do some amount of work to validate that. So I think there are core insights that are pretty translatable, but you have to understand the conditions for their usability and investigate whether those conditions exist. And in that case, there are things I think that you could sort of adapt fairly easily. And perhaps, I think Claire mentioned this, perhaps we don't always need an RCT then, because we're fairly confident it'll have some effect. It's nice to know how much.
Claire.
So, yeah, I don't think I have any more to add on that point. I think that's exactly how I tend to think about generalizability and transferability as well. And that it might be too simplistic to just throw your hands up and say nothing doesn't generalize, and that there are more systematic ways to go about it. But one thing I'll add is that I think this highlights the responsibility for researchers to design studies that really do illuminate underlying tendencies in human behavior and theories about human behavior, because it's these studies that are going to produce more transferable or portable insights. So not just, did it work or not, but, what caused it to work, how did it work, why did it work, and these are critical for thinking about applying these insights across contexts.
Thank you. And Helio, we're very glad to have Helio back with us again. Helio, the question, I guess, that we're answering at the moment, which would be great to get your insights on as well, is what kind of tips would you give to people for trying to try to look at the behavioural insights across different cultural contexts, and how transferable is that from developing economies to developed economies to emerging economies? I mean, what's been your experience in relation to that?
The experience of Akatu is very limited in using the methodology, methodological pedagogy, and the actions in other countries. We used them in 2 different occasions in Argentina, in 2 cities in Argentina, and once in Cuba, actually invited by UNEP. The experience was very interesting because since we we apply our methodology in workshops. So you always have people together. And these people will bring their experience to the workshop. The moment you start talking about consumption, how people consume, what is important in their lives, how they relate what's important in their lives to the way they consume, and then you pose the conflict between the important things for people and the way they use their money and their consumption. The discussion will give you cues on what's different and what's similar between cultures. And at least since our methodology is to use workshops with groups of people, we always have the opportunity of testing those differences. What I can say additionally is that Brazil is a very, very large country with very different cultures. And we have tested the methodology in these different regions, and we had good results in all of them. Of course, you have to have adaptation of language, and when I say language, is not to be able to speak the language, but it is able to speak the values in the same way. We use in one region, we use close the tap, and one child asked us what the tap is, because she hadn't a tap at home or in school. But anyway, given these adaptations of language, the experience of getting people together and talking about what actually is the social norms they use to consume, and how they are their habits are linked to these social norms, and what type of things they can derive from the examples that we bring, I think is always a good way, is a good tip on how to go about changing behavior in different societies.
Thank you, Helio. I'd like to ask all of you a bit more about something else that actually has been bothering me a bit as well. But it's a very good question from Arthur Getz Escudero and also Yanis Gouglis, which is more about what kind of information or visualization of information or feedback loops can actually where there's actually research to actually prove that they actually have a greater impact in terms of changing people's behavior. I mean, we have various pieces of information on, for instance, refrigerators or washing machines in relation to the different kind of consumption patterns that will happen. Increasingly, you're getting information from your airline in relation to the CO2 emissions that you're going to have. And also, there's been numerous questions in relation to technology and things like smart meters as well, and the use of smart meters, and how can the type of information being given by smart meters actually help achieve changes in people's consumption. And I'd like to almost ask it on 2 folds, because Claire, I mean, you mentioned, you know, in terms of CO2 emissions, households only account for 29% of them. And is this something of, the first question, I guess, is what kind of insights have you got from your experiences on that provision of information to change behaviors? And then secondly, do you think that potentially this is something that is something that will only have limited impact, and in fact going after, for instance, changing the behavior of industry might be something that could reap greater benefits as opposed to concentrating on smart meters for ordinary citizens instead? Who would like to take that juicy question first?
Well, I can try starting with a relatively simple answer. We don't have studies, scientific studies to prove it. But what we could see in experience in these 16 years that we've been working with changing behavior is that whenever the information given is, of course, meaningful, simple, understandable by consumers, if it has an impact on the budget of families, somehow, for instance, information on how efficient a refrigerator is, in a very simple form, A to D, A is more efficient, this will have an immediate change in behavior because people will relate to not wasting money in energy being spent which shouldn't be spent. In the same direction, we have experience with smart meters that show that if people are able to follow up on how much water they are using, in which equipment in the house, they will be looking at that and will be using it to change behavior. Our experience shows that most of that change will come because of the economic impact of that change, more than the social or environmental impact of the change. If we are asking for changes in things which are more complex, like climate change and CO2 emissions, then it would be, I think, much more difficult to get results from the simple information that we can give, unless you can give comparative information in the whole supply chain, for instance, of products, in different products that perform the same function, which I haven't seen yet in any case.
Claire, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I think, like Helio has already mentioned, that in terms of particularly energy and water consumption across many countries in the world, individual households have no idea the quantity that they are consuming because there's nothing in the automatic system of water billing or energy billing that shows us how much we're using when we actually have the time to make the choice to consume less. And so I do think it is worth investing in behavioral insights that might make things like quantity and providing benchmarks of how much people are consuming much more salient and easy to see in the moment when people are making decisions about how much to consume. And I think, you know, visual cues and information are important for that. Obviously, the home energy reports, which play both on tips, benchmarks, and social norms, but also I've seen a lot of technologies that alert people when they're being charged a higher price, either through text messages or visual cues on their thermostat so that they can make a choice to consume less right in the moment, perhaps when there's peak demand and the emissions consequences of energy use might be higher. So I think that's really exciting. In terms of, you know, prioritizing individuals or firms or institutions, I don't think I'm saying neglect individual households. I'm just saying don't neglect firms at the expense of individual households. And I think there is some interesting work recently about changing firm behavior. There's this really fascinating paper by John List and co-authors that I'm forgetting out of University of Chicago that talked about applying information and some behavioral insights to commercial airline pilots and getting them to reduce fuel use during flight. And because so much fuel is used on these long flights, and it adds up to a level that's quite large in terms of what you could get from households versus individuals. So I think there is some portability to corporations as well.
Thank you, Claire. Saugato.
Well, not that much to add, I think, to these excellent points that have been made, except perhaps to just say, and this also came up earlier, is that all of these things interact, right? So I think it's clear that providing information to consumers in and of itself may not be enough to get the kind of behavior change that we need, and it has a lot to do with how that information is provided. So I think the example that I often like to think about is, you know, there's a host of studies that find that financial education doesn't really change financial behavior, right? And so one response to that is to say, well, financial education is useless, we should give up on it. But another response is to say, maybe it's about what's being delivered, how it's being delivered, how relevant it is, and how difficult or easy it is to actually act on that. And so could we redesign some of these things in ways that make them more actionable, make them more immediate, make them more personal? And there is some work, so there's work by Antoinette Shore and others at MIT, which it does this, right? Which says, okay, can we boil this down into 5 simple things that a micro entrepreneur needs to do? And that seems to be effective. So what I would say there is exactly these issues about, how do you present this stuff becomes incredibly, what do you present? And I think it's important, and there's a behavioral sort of insight behind this as well about how people process and use information. And the sort of one line there, I think, often for policymakers is more is not better, right? So we have a tendency to try and sort of put everything in and give people a whole lot of information, and that may actually be counterproductive. So how you design it is important. But the final piece is that if you think about a lot of these examples we're talking about, they come exactly out of this confluence of some technology, some information, some other kind of technology. So what Claire just talked about, you couldn't do a bunch of this stuff if you didn't have smart meters, you didn't have smartphones, you didn't have ways to do these things in the moment. But even if you have smart meters, what it turns out is you then need to supplement it with things that give people these cues and these heuristics and these nudges in the moment so that they can actually sort of, the potential of these products is exploited to the maximum possible extent. So I think that's what's exciting, is sort of realizing that it's not as if either information or technology is going to solve it, but in some ways more technology is making certain kinds of information provision, certain kinds of targeting much more feasible than it used to be. How do we leverage that? And I think that's to me a very exciting area of work that we should be spending. But also too, I think again, Claire made such wonderful points. I keep going back to them. Talking about things that, is there anything that we would take and sort of, just say, okay, just do this. There's enough evidence behind this. And I'm beginning to think that maybe we should just get all utility companies in the world to think about how they could give their customers some kind of benchmark about what they're doing. Because in so many contexts and across different behaviors, this seems to be useful. People in general have no idea about what they're consuming, and is it too little, is it too much, how does it compare to other people? So if we, and these are simple things to do. And if we could try to operationalize this in kind of in a scalable, simple way, maybe that's what we should all be doing. So that's a thought.
Well, thank you very much, Saugato. And I mean, thank you for our time is up, but thank you very much for ending on such an exciting note. And in fact, actually, one of the things that you were mentioning there is something that we're actually looking to do here in the OECD about energy and about energy consumption, and potentially also some of the other points that we didn't get to talk about the difference between when do you need to just have behavioural interventions and when do you sometimes need to legislate or have regulatory interventions. And in fact, when do you sometimes need to have behaviourally informed regulatory interventions as well, is something else which maybe UNEP will have to organise another webinar in order for us to be able to discuss a lot further. But I guess firstly I'd like to thank everybody, Saugato, Helio and Claire, for your fantastic participation. I'm sure that the audience has found this as interesting as I have, and I look forward to working with you all a lot more. Thank you very much to GGKP for organising this, John and Sarah, and the great publication that's out. Everybody who's there should definitely go out and they should be reading this publication with great interest. And a final note of thanks to Rena, who many of you probably don't know, but she's the person who's kind of put this technological wonder, which is this webinar, together and made this all possible as well. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody for all of your participation. It's been great, and look forward to this not being the end, but rather this being the beginning of our various conversations and various collaborations together. So thank you very much, and wish you all a good day or morning or evening, wherever you are on the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.